Yeah, good to be back again this week. We're back for another exciting chapter in the African leadership. And yeah, it's all about Zimbabwe today. So let's get going. This is what we cover every week. Reflections on good leadership, post-independent nation building in Africa, how leaders are developing peace and prosperity for their countries, analysis on the political and macroeconomic performance, their moral and development ideologies, although ideologies are a bit harder to define these days, but we can kind of self-define them using some analysis, looking at their policies, their actions, inactions, their practices, disaster or good, positive or negative, and what impact it has on the citizens of their country and Africa as a whole. How we can promote stronger African-centered leadership culture in Britain. So it's also about, helping yourselves get a better understanding about how you can become great leaders for your country or your people. Right, let's have some reflections here. We start with a reference of the Ibrahim Prize for African Leadership. And as we mentioned before, this is the context of which this prize is given. Remember, it's only given for leaders who have left office. So just bear that in mind. So that's who that is. And he doesn't give it out every year. Sustainable prosperity. I'm hearing a bit of feedback, Nigel. I don't know if you can hear your phone or something.
How is it now?
Yeah, that's all right now.
Cool.
Yep, sustainable and equitable prosperity. This is the things he uses, exceptional role models. And of course, everybody knows, well, I'm assuming most people have heard of Mugabe. So obviously we're going to be talking quite a bit about him, but it's not just about him, but obviously it's a significant part of Zimbabwe's history over the years. And ensures that the African continent continues to benefit from their experience and wisdom. So that's only if they, as I said, they were out of power. So we needed to add a few things onto this because it wasn't comprehensive enough. So we've added in another perspective on leadership, which is honesty. Are they corrupt or honest? So I'll give you my thoughts on that. Delivered clear social progress, including on women. Left a strong economy. Well, that's a really interesting one for Zimbabwe because their economy is in serious crisis. So that's going to be an interesting one. Left strong and good institutions. Interesting. You'll see your perspective on that. Pan-African policy direction. Interesting as well. You get some interesting perspectives from me on that. Plan for succession. Well, there was a coup. So that's an interesting one too. So, right. So this is where we are. You'll see why I've got those other numbers on the side in a second. So we did Azania, South Africa, the first week. This is the World Happiness Report 2018. So that's where these countries are. So I've just added that on. I thought that was a bit interesting. So number 2 is Ghana. We did that last week. This week is Zimbabwe, the 144th in the World Happiness Report, which is pretty low. Most African countries are pretty low, but Zimbabwe is even lower. Then you've got Rwanda that's even lower than that, just slightly lower. Is the World Happiness Report. Ethiopia, Botswana, and then you've got South Sudan. So that's the program. So very interesting situation. So in terms of happiness, but again, you've got to be careful with any of these indicators because some of these indicators can be a little bit Eurocentric in the way that they're interpreted or the way that they're done. But nevertheless, it gives you some indication about supposedly what the people of the country think of the country. The highest ones, by the way, are, no surprise, are Western nations, but particularly the Scandinavian countries. They're the top 3: Sweden, Denmark, and Norway are the top 3, by the way. And normally quite high up there's New Zealand, places like that. So let's look at the Millennium Development Goals. I've added this in as well. I just wanted to put in a bit of context that the African Union adopted these in 2005 for Africa. Africa has made significant progress in a few areas, particularly primary school enrollment, and they have the best record of improvement in primary education. So remember, this is in the whole world. All right. So this is pretty good. I just want to say this because sometimes we have a doom and gloom view of Africa. It's not improving. And this demonstrates that actually we're doing pretty well, better than some people might expect. Doesn't mean we're where we want to be, but we're doing better than what we were. And at the end of the day, you can only measure progress from where you were from, not just where you're going to. So I just wanted to put a context to that so people get an understanding of that before we dive into one specific country. So gender equality, this is another area we've done particularly well. and tackling incidents of malaria and HIV and AIDS. The annual rate of reduction of under 5 mortality, again, was faster in the more recent times than it was in the earlier years. So we've done much better on that. And if you look at the amount of work that's done around insecticide treated mosquito nets, which is one of the best ways to protect people, because in Africa, to just keep on, you can't keep on taking malaria tablets for the whole of your life. You know, that's going to be crazy. So the best way to stop malaria is actually to stop the mosquitoes themselves, which is difficult when you haven't got all the sanitary and all the other things in place. And then the other thing is to protect you from being bitten in the night. So protecting children in particular with mosquito nets. So there's been a lot of work around that as well. So we've done a lot of work. So we come to Zimbabwe. Interesting case study, this one. A very large country geographically. So it's a relatively large country. If you look at this compared to England or compared to parts of Europe, it's still a relatively large country. Maybe not that large for Africa, but it's still pretty large land size and a very small population. It's one of the smallest populated countries for its land size in the world. I think Namibia is one of the highest in terms of, or the lowest, whichever way you want to look at it, in terms of very low population for the land size. So only 4.5 million people. I say only, still a decent number of people, but some places like Beijing, I think is, you know, some cities are bigger than the whole of this whole population. So relatively speaking, 14.5 million is not large. Very low numbers of white population. This is relevant later. Only about 30,000 white people live in Zimbabwe right now. And remember, this was another settler colonial nation like South Africa, but not on the scale of South Africa. Remember, when we talked about South Africa, it was 4.6 million whites. So 30,000 relatively, even though the population is bigger in South Africa, is absolutely minuscule in comparison. And even at its height, was only about 250,000 white people. So I'll come back to that. But that's just the context. So you see the size of the country, and you see where it is in Africa. So it's definitely called a Southern African country. Right, let's go to colonialism. Another thing I should mention is, I haven't really mentioned it before, so I think I should mention it here, is that Africa has a great history. I'm missing out thousands of years of great history because for the context of leadership and modern leadership, it's not that relevant what happened thousands of years ago. It's more relevant the post-colonial phase, because most of the leaders today are post-colonial leaders. They're not in the ilk of leaders from thousands of years ago. The context today is post-colonial, and Zimbabwe being one of the most recently uncolonized countries, you know, one of the few countries to get independence relatively late. If you think of when we did Ghana got independence in 1957 and Zimbabwe was 1980, so it's relatively recent, but obviously not as recent as South Africa, but relatively recent. So leaders are much more in the context of the post-colonial period. But I just take that as a given. Africa had great leaders. Africa had great leadership. Africa achieved great things before colonialism. So we're not starting our history of colonialism. We're just starting these sessions with colonialism because that's the context of which these leaders came out of. Okay, so I hope you just understand why I'm doing that. So Southern Rhodesia, many of you won't be old enough to remember those kind of language. Southern Rhodesia, I still remember this language, even though I wasn't that old in 1980. So let's have a look at the times and the most significant person. Some of you might remember that the recent Black Lives Matter campaigns talked about roads must go, and the road statues around Oxford, I think it's Oxford or Cambridge University, and other roads statues, because Rhodesia was a barbarian, basically, was a colonial, just a typical colonial imperialist, basically, which we'll talk a bit more. You can't talk about this part of the world without talking about Cecil Rhodes. Okay, so the British arrived around 1880. I'm not going to go back further than that because that's the most relevant history, really, the British colonialism. As usual, what they did at that time is they come in with a company and the army. Those are the two. This is the way colonialism generally happened. A company because they come for resources, and the army to make sure they protect themselves. So, you know, they overrule, basically overpower the people who are there. And remember that, without saying as well, but it's worth mentioning here so you understand the context. Every single country that was colonized had massive resistance. It took Europe hundreds and hundreds of years to colonize us. We resisted, and there was wars, armies, fighting, rebellions, you name it. So the whole history of colonialism wasn't just white people came and they just colonized us. It took hundreds of years to consolidate themselves to the stage where they could rule directly. And lots of them, like you see in Ghana, they were just on the coast. They didn't penetrate the whole country. You can see, like, even in the invasion in Iraq, if you want the most recent war, you can bomb the life out of a country and win the war, as in the army stop fighting. But to take control of the country is a whole new ball game. It's not that simple. And remember, this is without modern technology. So in those days, you didn't have the modern aircraft and, you know, all the technology you have now, where you can have massive bombing campaign from aircrafts like you would now, and, you know, missiles and all used by technology, digital technology. You didn't have that then. So to occupy a country as large as Zimbabwe is very, very difficult, because you wouldn't have the kind of army that could do it, and you don't have the logistics in place. So you just got to understand the context. We did resist. Some people get this delusional thought that we kind of just let these people come in, and we didn't resist. So I just want to put that context. So anyway, the company was called the British South Africa Company. Remember the other one, the East Africa Company, was the one that came into South Africa. So there's a very simple pattern here. Come in with a company, the company sponsored by the government or sponsored by the Queen or the royal family, right? So the similar pattern of imperialism, the royal family or the government sponsor companies. They give them agents special dispensation to go into countries and colonize them, or, you know, overrun them. Basically, they're pirates. Basically, it's pirates. If you read the book Be More Pirate, you'll hear the whole history of pirates, and it's a very positive message around pirates. But, you know, if you're African, you can't be that positive about the whole history of pirates. But if you read that book, Be More Pirate, you get a better understanding of what pirates were, and that pirates were given license from the state. So states like Britain gave licenses to people who were basically bandits. It's a bit like giving a license to a drug dealer or you know, a gangster today. Basically, that's what they did. And those gangsters will go and ransack an area. So it's like saying, right, I'm going to give a license to Nigel and his gang, and they can go and ransack Hackney. And the loot that they get, they can share some of it with the British government, and they actually give you a license to go and do that. So when you have to understand the barbarity of this behavior, there was no concept of go to this country and build a relationship with them and let's do some trade. That was never the thing. It was, we'll give you a license to go and ransack the place and to exploit the place. So it was never about collaboration. So it's really important we understand this. So Rhodes obtained a concession for some mining rights. And when we say obtain concessions, these are very polite ways of putting this. Remember, people are beaten into submission with a point where people feel they've got no choice but to make a decision. You see, we have to understand this is not like equals sitting at a table, right? This is people who've had war, and you might not want to have war anymore. Your people are dying, being killed, land is being lost. And they might say, look, we will stop warring with you if you give us access to that mine. And since lots of these countries at the time, if you think of the 1980s, were not industrialized. So Zimbabwe wasn't industrialized. So whether the king of the Ndebele people could exploit that mine, as I said, exploit as in have mechanical machinery and go and dig that mine, or have human beings dig the mine and make money out of it, that wasn't the concept at the time. So it wouldn't necessarily seen as a big concession at the time. But clearly the British knew the amount of money they could make from these mines. And we see the history of all these colonized nations, the same thing. So he got this concession. As I said, it's always the government and the royal family. Look at this. Rhodes presented his concession to persuade the UK government to grant a royal charter to his company over the Matabele land. So you see how somebody sitting in the royal household in Britain and with the government work together to allow this man to have a company that can overrule a whole people. It's madness, but this is the context in which we do this. So putting on fancy clothes and writing pieces of paper doesn't make you civilized, okay? Because it's the barbarity of what you're doing, but you don't see it when you see these people together having nice wine and wearing nice clothes. You don't see the barbarity of what they're doing. When they sign that piece of paper and let somebody go and ransack a country, you don't see that part of it. So we have to understand the context here. So as you see, his name keeps coming up, Rhodes again. He promoted the idea of colonialism over the land with British control over the labor as well as the precious metals and the mineral resources. So, you know, he's promoting this all. He's their agent, basically, overseas agent, doing this for them. Right, let's go a bit more. So, as you obviously can see, the name was adopted Rhodesia for the territory of Zambezia, as it was at the time, in honor of Rhodes. I mean, it's just crazy. Name a whole people's country or a people's territory based on some white colonial person that comes into the country. It's just madness. So, of course, it wasn't done by us. When we say the name was adopted, it says his company adopted the name, not the people. This is just over the heads of the people. So this is where the name Southern Rhodesia came from in the context of what Zimbabwe became. So we have to understand the context here. You'll see somewhere called Metabeleland, which was Zambia, which is now Zambia, Northern Rhodesia, which is Zambia, and sorry, let me say that again. Metabeleland, which is Malawi, Northern Rhodesia, which is Zambia, and Southern Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe. That's the context you have to understand this with. So if you look it up on a map, that will give you the geopolitical context of when Rhodes talks about this territory, he means those three countries that we would identify as three countries today. So it's a very big landmass we're talking about. Okay, so that's why it says here, including Northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, and Southern Rhodesia was annexed by the United Kingdom in 1923. So that's how these countries come about. It's such a interesting history to see how these countries come about by other people annexing countries and saying this is the land and that's the land. And then we get very proud of these land territories. So we have to be very careful what we're really proud of. Other people creating conditions. So under a new constitution, Southern Rhodesia became a self-governing British colony. What on earth does that mean? What it means is that Rhodes, again, was given license by the Queen or the King at the time and the British government that they can self-govern. You can govern it on our behalf. So you govern that on our behalf. So you're now the governor of that territory. So, of course, the people weren't asked whether they wanted this guy to be the governor. He's just appointed by somebody as far away as Britain. So now check this out. This is a soft sentence, but you'll see I always highlight in color because you need to pick up the key things here. This is a soft sentence, but think about this for a minute. Southern Rhodesia contributed more per capita, that's per person, to both the First and Second World Wars. This is the First and Second Imperialist Wars because it weren't world wars. They were just European. Remember I said white on white violence? The First and Second World War, what millions of white people killed millions of other white people and got other people involved, but that's not the language that's used. So than any other part of the empire. So remember, the British Empire at one time owned, what was it, 40%, 60% of the world, of the people of the world. So Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, contributed more money to the British war effort than any other part of the British Empire, including Britain. Think about this. Think about this seriously. Southern Rhodesia produced more wealth than any part of the empire, including Britain, to the Second and First World War. Can you see our contribution, how our resources have been stolen? And imagine if those resources were all invested in Zimbabwe. But those resources were taken out of the country and invested somewhere else. But if those resources were invested in Zimbabwe, what would Zimbabwe look like now? It would be like Norway or Denmark or whatever now, right? So that's why I wrote the word exploitation next to that sentence, because you can read this sentence and not think much of it, but this is a very big sentence. So always be aware when you're studying to pick up these things. Right, colonialism consolidated. So we're moving fast with the years, right? We're bumping through years just for the sake of time. So 1953, Britain united these three territories that I mentioned to you before. Sorry, it was I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Nyasaland, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Nyasaland, which is Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Basically, those three territories were united, and they put it into a territory and gave it a name, basically. They called it a union. Within 10 years, it was dissolved because we fought against it, we resisted, and we made it ungovernable, and it just didn't work. So it was like an experiment. They did it for 10 years, and then it broke up. because the people resisted against it. So that's just a bit of context. So now this is the big story. UDI. Ian Smith, a white man living in Zimbabwe, okay, in 1964, declared unilateral declaration of independence, commonly known as UDI. In other words, he sat in Zimbabwe, made a phone call or sent a note to the British government and the Queen or the King, and said, I am declaring independence and I'm running this country myself. Thank you very much. Goodbye, Britain. So 240,000 white people said they were going to rule over Zimbabwe with obviously no consultation with our people. They just decided that this is now our country and we're running it from here. So Ian Smith basically is the king of the land of Zimbabwe. He decided to run it himself. Of course, this is the contradiction now. So what did Britain do? Did Britain send soldiers and go and shoot Ian Smith and invade the country and say, no, this is our colony, we're not letting you do this? No. What Prime Minister did, and remember this was the Labour government because it was Harold Wilson in power at the time, he went to the UN. This is kind of really weird, this, isn't it? It's like, I've got a house in the Caribbean. A few of my friends take the house over and say, it's now my house. And I'm powerful, right? I'm a powerful person, right? I'm a government, right? I don't go down to there and send some troops and put some licks on them and take the house back. What I do is I go to United Nations. This is Britain, who is a powerful nation, right? They go to United Nations and ask to put sanctions on Zimbabwe. How strange is that? Don't you find that a very strange part of history? Why would you put sanctions on them? My father told me, and I always remember this, my father's from Barbados. He said to me, Harold Wilson said, because in 1964, I wasn't born yet. My dad said to me that Harold Wilson said, we will not send bombs on our kith and kin. So in other words, Wilson was very clear that Ian Smith and the 240 white were his family, part of his kith and kin. So there's no way he was going to send troops to put down his own white people. Could you imagine if the blacks and the Africans in Zimbabwe had taken power at that time, what Wilson would have done? Send troops into the country. So it's just interesting that he didn't do that for them. So, and that's where that quote came from. He wouldn't declare war on his kith and kin. I always remember my father telling me that story. So, independence struggle, wherever there's oppression, there's resistance. Now you'll see the two main political parties. So I'm now introducing you to the African struggle now. So UDI is declared, unilateral declaration of independence, and it led directly to a guerrilla war. Because, of course, we as Africans are not going to accept that a group of white people can say, this is now our country, we're now ruling it, and that's it. And those 240,000 people, which is about the population of Waltham Forest in northeast London, or the population of an average London borough, they're now going to rule over the whole country. And of course, the Africans said, no, we're not accepting this. And remember, with all resistance, I'm not going into all the detail here, but with all countries, there was civil rights, there were protests, there were marches, there were all of those peaceful things. And of course, nobody's listening, nothing's happening. And when they did this universal Declaration of Independence in 1964. Remember, 1964 is a time when Africa is becoming independent. China's had its war. All these countries of the world, Cuba has already had its revolution. India has got independence. All the major countries in the world have got independence all around the world. And in 1964, you're talking about UDI. So you've got to understand the historical context of when this is happening. This is not happening in 18th century, 19th century. This is 1964. This is that's 7 years after Ghana got independence. As a group of white people saying they're going to take over Zimbabwe. It's not going to happen. So these are the two major parties that existed at the time. Joshua Nkomo. So Nkomo and Mugabe were the two major players, and they were current leaders of these two parties. So Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, and Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU. And you'll see how these merge, and that's how ZANU-PF became the merged organization between the two. But we'll come back to that. We'll come back to how that happened. Okay, so these were the two major players. Generally left of center parties, looking left-leaning parties. You'll see that one, ZAPU, which was the one by Nkomo, was supported by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. and countries like Cuba, and was much more Marxist-Leninist in its ideology. Remember, Marxist-Leninism is a useful methodology to understand capitalism and the systems, but it's not our ideology. It doesn't come out of Africa. Similarly, ZANU was more leaning to Maoism under Chairman Mao in China, and more related to the People's Republic of China. So in the 1960s, the Cold War was at its height. And basically, liberation struggles wouldn't get any support, obviously, from Britain, from the West, from NATO, from any of the Western countries like America, etc. So the only place we could go was to places like China and the Soviet Union. They were the only people who had the sort of arms and the political will to support the liberation struggles in Africa. So typically, political parties would lean to one or the other. Now, can I add a little bit of cynicism here? Or realism? Now, does it mean that because liberation organizations in those days, the only place they were going to get support is the Soviet Union or China, doesn't necessarily mean that they were pro-socialist or pro-communist? It's assumed they were, but dialectically, we look at this dialectically, look at the forces in tension here. Look up the word dialectics, by the way, but look at the forces in tension. There's no way you're going to get armed support. There's no way you're going to get support by any nations in the world apart from what we call the frontline states, which is the African states that are around you. But remember, the African states around them weren't independent. Mozambique, Angola, South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, all these countries were in the middle of a warfare. They were in the middle of a major, similar warfare and similar battle. So none of these countries could easily support Zimbabwe. So the only way you was going to get support is from other African nations or from other anti-imperialist countries at that time, Soviet Union and China. So unless you said you were socialist, unless you said you were Maoist or Marxist-Leninist, they weren't going to support you. So in a way, it makes me wonder how many of these parties were generally left-leaning and generally socialist at the time, or was it more convenient at the time? So if you understand the history of Cuba, for example, Cuba didn't say they were socialist until 1961. And until 1961, they tried very hard to build a relationship with the United States. And it was only after the United States put sanctions on them and tried to invade them that they basically felt forced to go into the hands of the Soviet Union. And that's when they became officially a Marxist-Leninist Cuban revolution. So you've got to understand the history of these things. And remember, the Communist Party of Cuba, let me just go back a minute. The Communist Party of Cuba was not part of that. Fidel Castro was not part of the Communist Party of Cuba. He was part of the July 26 movement. Okay, he wasn't part of the Communist Party. Later on, Fidel Castro and the government became the Communist Party, but the Communist Party wasn't involved really in the revolution in 1959. So it's very important we understand these little nuggets of history. So by 1978, so we've now gone 14 years, the level of resistance had got to the stage where Ian Smith had to negotiate. So this man, Ian Smith's been in power for 14 years, running a country with no democratic authority to do it. Okay, no legitimacy whatsoever. 14 years of armed resistance. And Mugabe was imprisoned for 10 years, by the way, by Smith. And, all the same things that happened in Ghana. At the day of independence, which I'll come to in a minute, just like in Ghana when we spoke last week, Nkrumah was in jail when he became the prime minister. And when Mugabe became the prime minister, he was in jail as well. So you see the irony and the madness of this situation. So let's have a look at this. So basically what happened in 78, there was an internal agreement with whoever this is. Now, I have no idea who Muzariwa was, but it wasn't full independence. I can only assume they were kind of some kind of compromise, kind of lackey or somebody who wasn't really for full independence. I don't know why this person would have agreed this. And basically that agreement was never going to stand because the masses of the people was never going to stand for this kind of semi-independent situation like South Africa, some kind of Bantustan type of situation. So of course the resistance continued and then inevitably came. So the fifth Commonwealth Heads of State Government, which is known as Shogum, which Shogum is where all the heads of state of the Commonwealth countries come together, which was going to be in Rwanda in June. So that was going to be the next Chogum meeting. And that Chogum meeting was the fifth one, which was held in Lusaka in Zambia which is just next door, in 1979, where there was negotiation and discussions with the British government, which was Thatcher, by the way, at that time. This was now Thatcher, and Lord Carrington was the Foreign Secretary. And that participation and that discussion created a constitutional conference called the Lancaster House. Now, many of you, if you do your little Googling, put the Lancaster House Agreement. Most of us knew this from years ago. The Lancaster House Agreement was the agreement between ZANU, ZAPU, and the British government, basically for independence and the new constitution, which was a compromise. Even that was a compromise as well, which I'll come to in a minute. So let's go to the next stage. Yes, so this was why I was saying that Lancaster House Agreement was such a critical and relevant situation, because the Lancaster House Agreement basically agreed willing buyer, willing seller. This is back to the same story we heard before in South Africa. So they had form on this before in South Africa by the time South Africa had their independence, or so-called end of apartheid. So the British government basically agreed that Zimbabwe could do land reform after 10 years, and that the British government would help pay for it. So I say that again. The British government agreed that they could do land reform, but not for the first 10 years, and the British government would contribute to the cost. Of course, they were never going to do this. This is all sham nonsense. But anyway, it was in writing that they were going to do it. So, and the land could be sold willing buyer, willing seller, which is another nonsense, which we said last week, because if you haven't got any money, how can you be say you're willing buyer, willing seller when the seller won't sell it unless you pay the millions for it, which they stole from you in the first place. Next point. So, yeah, next point. So during the elections, Mugabe won, which was a surprise, because a lot of the British and others thought that Nkrumah would have won the election, but he didn't win. So actually, Mugabe won with a landslide and became the prime minister of the country in 1980, and they got their independence. And they guaranteed, part of the agreement was to guarantee 20 seats for the whites, which is crazy, but anyway, that was what was agreed at the time. So then came this massacre. Now, what happened is, after independence, there was resistance from the Matabele land. Well, different language can be used for different reasons. I'm not sure they would use the same language I'm using, but anyway, there was a view that Matabele land should be independent, and that there was some resistance, and that resistance led to some problems, which meant that the Mugabe certainly interpretation of it, or the government's interpretation, was they were like rebels. They were like a terrorist group virtually in that area. And people estimate anything from 3,000 to 80,000 people. I don't know what the true figure is, but thousands of people were killed. And some people describe it as a massacre. And some people say that Mugabe and the current president, who was around at the time, part of the government, this was a war crime. And this was such a serious violation of human rights of the people. I don't know the history of this. I don't know enough about it in detail, but clearly that accusation has always been hanging over Mugabe and his government, that this was a brutal put down. In war, it's difficult. So anyway, in Nkrumah and Mugabe, there was still some tension between the two forces, but in the end, they decided that they would form a coalition, which, when you have a coalition or an integration, basically one takes over. So basically, Mugabe took over, basically. So Nkrumah and Mugabe agreed, and they created, as I said, the Patriotic Front. So this is where ZANU became ZANU PF. So effectively, ZAPU was no more. Okay, so it's a very significant part of history there. So now we have to now look at the context of which Mugabe was praised, and the leadership of Zimbabwe in the struggle for Southern Africa, why it's so significant, this bit. Because basically Zimbabwe was active in the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement was basically a coalition of non-white governments who were not aligned to the Soviet Union or America. So at that time, you had the Cold War. Most countries were aligned to one or the other. They decided, many African countries said, we're not aligned to anybody. We don't want to be aligned to any one force, even though they were politically aligned in practice, but they didn't want to be openly aligned, as in saying that they're aligned. Okay. So part of that was sanctions against South Africa. So Zimbabwe was a staunch supporter of sanctions against South Africa and supported the forces ANC, the PAC, and Frelimo as well. Frelimo in Mozambique, and to such an extent that 12,000 troops from Zimbabwe were fought to fight off Renamo, which is a CIA-backed reactionary organization that was basically armed and supported by white South Africa, by Zionist Israel, and by United States to stop Zimbabwe getting independence for a progressive government. That's basically what that was all about. And Mugabe was fundamental. So this whole thing, what we used to call the frontline states, Southern Africa was called the frontline. The frontline states were the states around South Africa. So the frontline states were Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, those states that were immediately around South Africa. So Zimbabwe was significant. Now that becomes very significant when later South Africa under Mbeki is put under massive pressure to remove or help remove Mugabe and put sanctions on South Africa, on Zimbabwe. But South Africa resisted it. And part of it was the historical relationship between the ANC and ZANU-PF, which is very, very strong. So don't matter what they said to Mbeki, he wouldn't betray Mugabe and wouldn't support regime change. So let's go to the next slide. This is where all the trouble started. Now, there were some positive things that was achieved during Mugabe's early years. You know, there was a lot of education. I'll come to that in a minute anyway. But the big major issue was this whole IMF loan. Basically, the ZANU-PF government got into some difficulties by the 1990s and decided to take an IMF loan. And if you took an IMF loan in those days, you had to have severe structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment programs is just a clever language for neoliberalism, which is basically saying the same old right-wing nonsensical political decision-making, which is cut the state, cut public spending, privatize everything that you can think of privatizing, which means that the businesses and the state structures go in the hands of private individuals. And those private individuals are not any private individuals. They're not the masses. They're the rich people who can invest in these businesses, or the rich companies or big companies who can come in and take over major assets of the society, of the state. So that was the major problem. But ZANU-PF did campaign back in 1990, agreeing to do land reform. Because in 1990, that was the 10 years were up. So then ZANU-PF could do land reform. So it was agreed in 1990 that they would redistribute the land to the masses. But there's a but coming. Next one. So some land was redistributed, but not really in any significant way. And there was criticism that, you know, that accusations that ZANU-PF was giving it to some of its members. But there's been independent studies since and said that the land reform definitely did go to the masses, but not at this stage. Next one. And basically what happened is, ZANU-PF officially dropped scientific socialism as their ideology and agreed new program of on a mixed economy. So this is where all the trouble started. When I say trouble, this is where the masses started to resist Mugabe and his leadership, because now it became painful, because now Mugabe was forced to cut public spending, cut spending on healthcare, education, etc. So the people started to suffer, jobs were lost, and the privatization of the economy, and even though that was resisted by Zimbabwe. So the economy started to get into difficulties. And this is where they had to cut 32,000 jobs. Now, remember, the population of Zimbabwe is only 40 million now. So in those times, it's probably less than half what it is now. So to cut 32,000 jobs is a lot of jobs, okay? That's a lot of people being in pain. So it's really is quite a big issue. Savage cuts, as you see, on health and education spending. And this is where the students rose up against the government. And this is where it started to get hot. This is where things started to get really heated now, because 10,000 students is no small number. Started to rise up because of the conditions. So the unions went on strike as well, and there was a general strike. And this is where MDC came to forefront, because the movement for democratic change was basically came out the trade union movement, and the trade union movement was resisting these changes to the economy, and those changes to the economy were hurting the people. And so the people blamed ZANU-PF. They didn't blame the international structural program or the West. They blamed the government. And that's the power of sanctions. sanctions and economic pressure is a way of forcing a government to be changed by its people, because the people come to resent the government and want change. So the idea of so-called regime change, because you couldn't just openly invade Zimbabwe anymore. They just had colonialism and just had a war. You couldn't justify open invasion. So the backdoor way of doing it is to get the people to rise up against the government. And this has been the strategy since 1990 right up to today. 30 years later, they're still trying to do regime change. And that's why the sanctions are still there. So let's go to the next one. So this is where things got a bit, as I said, got hot. And this is where troops were sent in to suppress the masses. And Zimbabwe ended up in 95 getting another IMF loan. So next one, we can go to the next slides. Right, so here's some critical moments. Let's look at this. Okay, let's look at what happened next. So ZANU-PF won the election back in 96, and now we're up into 97. So we're getting rapidly up to current times. 67% of Zimbabweans live below the poverty line. So it's a huge number now in 96. So this is a serious, serious situation. It was only 25% in the 1980s. So more people live below the poverty line. And when we talk poverty, we're talking about like living on less than a couple of dollars a day. So we're really talking, really struggling here. Okay. So this shows the economic decline of Zimbabwe in that time. Okay. So from the 80s to now, the economic situation was really escalating. Now, what happened in 1997 in Britain? Next one. Okay. The students asked for them to step down, but actually this is in the wrong order. But anyway, it doesn't matter. It's close enough. So that's when people started to demand, or the youth started to demand, that Mugabe must go. This was back in 98. So that tells you 22 years ago. So this has been a serious issue for a long time. So what happened in 97? Next one. In 97, the Labour government was elected. And when the Labour government got elected, remember, Mugabe was never in power during Labour government. Okay? They came to the negotiations in 79, which is when Thatcher was in power. And all the way up to 1997, it was Conservative governments. So this is the first time a Labour government was in power. So Mugabe naively maybe thought that the Labour government would be more friendly to them and would honour the Lancaster House Agreement, which is where the British government said they would pay to assist the land reform. Of course, what happened? Clare Short famously, look up the history, Clare Short was the minister for DFID, the Minister for Department of Overseas Investment, basically. And basically what happened is Clare Short said, I'm Irish. This is literally, we got the letter because it was in the African, the magazine, I've forgotten the name of the African magazine, but it was in there and it was published, the whole letter. And basically Clare Short said, my family's from Ireland. We have never colonized anybody. So she didn't take any responsibility for what the British government had done previously or honored the agreement of before, and said that it's nothing to do with the Labour government. We didn't agree with this, so we're not going to compensate you at all. This was the beginning of Armageddon. This was the major moment in history. That's why I've got it in red. This was the major moment in history where what was described as the veterans said to Mugabe, we're not waiting anymore. We've waited 17 years. You agreed 10. It's now 17 years later. The Labour government has made it absolutely clear you're not getting any money from us. So you're getting no money to help redistribute the land. So the veterans started to take the land. That's when they started to go on the land, beat up the farmers and take the land. That's when this whole current situation kicked off. So even though under the Mugabe ZANU-PF government, he had power or agreed in the election that he would take the land, he was still very nervous about doing it and implementing it. But the veterans said, we're not waiting anymore. We're fed up of this. And they started to take up weapons and go and take the land forcefully off the whites. This is where it became into international crisis. This is where under Blair, they started sanctions on Zimbabwe because they were taking the land from the whites. And even though it's a Labour government, they're as imperialistic as the others. And they decided to put sanctions. They asked the European Union to support them and America to support them. And they blocked Zimbabwe from getting loans and access to finance and just basically crippled the country. And 20 years, Zimbabwe has been under sanctions. Look it up. You can do the research yourself. 20 years of economic sanctions. Those economic sanctions have absolutely strangled the government. And even the UN called them illegal sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe following Zimbabwe's fast-track land reform program. So as soon as that was implemented, that's when they decided, you know what, we're not letting you take the lands from our kith and kin, so we're going to put sanctions on you. Next one, please. So now we go into another part of history now. So now it's 1999, and the movement for democratic change, Shangarai and co were moving further and further. And there was loads of allegations that MDC was being funded by the British government. I've never had proof of it, absolute proof, but I believe that there was some evidence that there's no doubt that there was evidence that the British state was supporting them. Whether they were supporting them financially, I don't know, but they were certainly politically supporting them, and that was fairly open. They were saying that Mugabe should step down, he's getting old, and we should have democratic elections and let MDC basically win the election. So MDC, can you believe this? MDC called for sanctions on their own country. Can you believe that? MDC called for sanctions against their own government. So that to hurt their own people, to get rid of the government. That's how much they want to get rid of them. Now, one of the things we have to understand in history is however much you're against something, what people should ask is, what are you for? And up to this day, I'm still waiting to find out what MDC are for, other than being against ZANU-PF. But what are they for? But basically, MDC was going to give their land, as far as I can see, give their country over to the Europe, give the land over in terms of just implementing more neoliberal policies, and nothing progressive at all was going to come out of the MDC. They never proposed socialism, Pan-Africanism, or any kind of progressive reform program to redistribute the land or the resources. They don't have to even say socialism, but what did they say? Up to now, I still don't even know what MDC really would believe in. So this is what happened. And these illegal sanctions really crippled the country, and it's still in economic crisis now. So even the Danish governments, the Swedish governments, they all pulled out their funding. China, Russia, 2008, now we go up to more recent times. In 2008, China and Russia vetoed and disagreed with the sanctions. But the problem is, even though you disagree with the United Nations, next one, disagree with the United Nations sanctions, the problem is Europe and America, two of the biggest economic blocs. And if they're not trading with Britain, I mean, trading with Zimbabwe is a problem. Now, here's the criticism of leadership. Two big criticisms. One, when ZANU-PF was organizing in Britain with forces like organizations that I knew about, we had strong relationships, and people had strong relationships with ZANU-PF. We supported the Zimbabwe and all that. As soon as Zimbabwe got independence, most of the people moved back to Zimbabwe. Perfectly understandable. But when the embassies opened, when the Zimbabwe embassy opened, there was no reach out to the forces on the ground, no reach out to the Black community in Britain, no reach out to the Pan-Africanist community in Britain, no reach out to have a diasporal connection between ZANU-PF and the diasporal world. This is my criticism of the leadership of Zimbabwe. They did not have a Pan-African focus. Now, the reasons why the chickens came home to roost is because when Mugabe and Zimbabwe were put under sanctions and the economic bite was coming, they then started to act more Pan-Africanist. They started to reach out to African countries. They started to reach out to people in Britain because now they needed our support to be against the sanctions. But here's the criticism. You can't, when you break those relationships, you have a problem. And there was a nationalist tendency to support Mugabe because Mugabe was against imperialist forces coming into Zimbabwe. And MDC were not saying they were going to resist anything. So that's why Mugabe became stronger and stronger. In the view of Africans around the world, people saw Mugabe as the force of progression and saw MDC and Shangarai as the force of reaction and the force of negativity, and didn't see they were defending the interests of Zimbabwe. This is why when Mugabe went to the UN, he got a standing ovation. When Mugabe turned up for the African Union, he got a standing ovation because it was seen by Africans and non-Europeans that Mugabe was standing up to the Western imperialism. And that's why he was so seen as a positive. So what happened in 2009, just go back one, just what happened in 2009, there was a unity government because there was enormous pressure from the West to form a unity government with Shangarai, other forces. So you had the prime minister. So Shangarai became the prime minister under Mugabe. It was all a sham, this, by the way. And Arthur Mutambari became one of the deputy prime ministers, as well as this other figure, which I'm not so familiar with. But there was two MDCs, so there was two different MDC factions. So and therefore this is why they had this compromise with so many different people with all these factions. So they tried to give space to all these. So next one, you'll see at the bottom here, that was the coalition on the bottom left. That was the coalition between those four leaders that I just mentioned. And on the right, guess who that is? Yeah, that was Arthur Mutumbori. He was one of the deputy prime ministers. That's when he came to Britain a few years ago to do a speech. And yeah, I bought his book. I was here and I listened to his speeches. So we managed to get a picture together. So that's just a bit of interesting, just a little interesting picture I found. I forgot that I even had that picture, but I found it when I was looking for some pictures. So it was all symbolic because that wasn't a sham. We all know there was a real power struggle between Mugabe. Mugabe and ZANU-PF were never going to give up power to MDC. So they did it for international protocol reasons, but Changarai and the MDC constantly complained that they were frustrated by ZANU-PF not really allowing them to rule properly. So real power remained with Mugabe and ZANU-PF. The West still didn't end the sanctions anyway, so what was the point? And they still were crippling the country. So let's look at the rise and fall of Mugabe now. Let's just look at a few issues here. That's the flag basically of ZANU-PF, and that's Mugabe when he was a bit younger. So this is what Mugabe said, and this is one of the reasons, again, why he became a kind of a symbol of anti-imperialism and a symbol of black nationalism and African nationalism. Because he basically said, sorry, just shut this window. He basically said this speech, this was just a paraphrasing one part of his speech. Shame, shame, shame to the United States of America. Remember, this is UN Assembly, which is in New York. Shame, shame, shame to Britain and all its allies. Zimbabwe is for Zimbabweans, so are its resources. Please remove your illegal and filthy sanctions from my peaceful country. So Mugabe was basically trying to get support around the world to end the sanctions, but the sanctions were crippling. Here's my other criticism of leadership. Post-colonial governments should not put all their eggs in the colonial basket and assume that the ex-colonial leader is going to remain friends. So Mugabe, remember, was knighted by the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party gave Mugabe a knighthood. So they liked Mugabe. He was a friend of Britain until he took the land. That's when it all fell apart. So he was a good man. He was a good African because they gave him a knighthood. And therefore, you have to understand the context here. So this is the context in which we're talking about in this situation. They only got a problem when Mugabe decided to take the land. So these sanctions are crippling the country. So it's a foreign policy tool to achieve short-term regime change. And you notice countries that are not liked by the British government or the American government or the West are called regimes. They're governments when you like them, and they're regimes when you don't like them. And the media, puppets of the media, all use the same language. And this is why I was saying that it's a failure of leadership to not recognize that after independence, you don't want to do all your trade with Britain. You must diversify your trade with the whole world, because as soon as Britain you fell ill of Britain, and Britain no longer were happy with Zimbabwe and Mugabe, the sanctions really hurt because the economy was so tied up with Britain and the British businesses. So this is when Mugabe started to go to China and started to try and diversify, try to work with different countries, and again went Pan-Africanist, looking to African help. But why wasn't he doing that straight after independence, diversifying the economy and making sure others were involved? When we do Rwanda, you'll see the difference in terms of the post-colonial period, where Rwanda hasn't got their tentacles, not got a relationship just with France or just with Britain. They've got a relationship with a wider variety of different countries. So if you ever decide to put sanctions on Rwanda, it's a little bit more difficult to do it if you haven't got all the support of all the different countries. So that's the problem. Right, let's keep going. So other forces were involved. These are the forces of resistance. Sorry, just go back one. Just need to see those forces of resistance. So there was ISO Zimbabwe, which was a socialist basically front organization, Free Zim's Youth, and WOZA, women's organization of Zimbabwe. These were some of the resistance movements to Mugabe. So even though, as I said, Mugabe and ZANU-PF were seen as quite positive, there was serious corruption. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it was embarrassing for Mugabe's new wife, second wife, to be going around the world showing off with all the shopping trips she was going on and buying all sorts of expensive stuff. Mugabe was having birthday parties that were extravagant, spending millions of pounds on birthday parties when the people were struggling and in massive poverty. So this is the kind of thing that creates a contradiction with leadership. You see your people struggling and you're having extravagant birthday parties and your wife is going around the world buying all these shoes and things that she doesn't need with basically the state money, because Mugabe didn't have a business, did he? Where did Mugabe get his money from? Oh, it's gone off full screen view. Need to put it back on full screen view there. Yeah, it's not back on full screen view. At the bottom. Yeah, that's the other way you can do it. You can do it that way as well. Yeah. So just go to slide 2. Start slide 2. Yeah. So this is what happened. There's a real problem of the land redistribution was very, very popular amongst Africans all around the world. Of course it would be. Why wouldn't it be? Of course it would be popular, because it's seen as standing up again to the West and a just cause. So even though it was a just cause, it didn't work very well, because the situation was there's a lot of poverty. So it was symbolic against white power. So that's why Africans around the world were so supportive of Mugabe and very protective of Mugabe when others were criticizing him. So let's keep going. So, but ZANU-PF was never Pan-Africanist, not as far as I can see. You can tell me different if we want to have a discussion, but I don't see any evidence that ZANU-PF were Pan-Africanists at any time. The behavior of the colonial masters does not excuse what was going on with Zimbabwe. So even though the West were wrong and the colonial masters were wrong, but Mugabe was also wrong in the behavior that he was having, as I said, having extravagant waste of money whilst his people were suffering in poverty. Next one. So this is where we said there was even more unrest as the IMF loans and the whole situation led to a crisis. So we're going to go to the next one and the whole thing of the, let's look at a Pan-Africanist view now. So we're just going to take a sidebar with this. Unofficial sanctions were imposed by Britain and supported by the West, and it's the primary cause, see I've got it in red, the primary cause of the economic hardship. So whatever your views on Zimbabwe, the solution must be by Africans for Africans. So next couple of lines. So it doesn't matter whether Mugabe may be have loads of contradictions, but it's our contradiction, because it's Africa is our continent, and only people of African descent and African people around the world should decide the fate of Africa. Nobody else. It's not for other people to decide our fate. Just like would Britain accept that Africans in Zimbabwe should decide Britain or Brexit? Is it for Zimbabwe or Angola or Libya or Morocco or Nigeria or Ghana to decide whether Britain is going for Brexit or not going for Brexit? So it's got nothing to do with Britain and the West, how Mugabe rules and what goes on. It's to do, yes, there can be international views on it. I'm not saying you can't, but how we decide to deal with it is African problem on it. So we should have an African solution. We don't want external interference in our control. So state brutality was commonplace in Zimbabwe, I'm afraid. And Zimbabwe's problems were not unique. They reflect the lack of power that African masses have over our lives and the lack of land. And that's the problem that we have because of the lack of land, lack of power. And that's why this led to this situation. So let's keep going. Second level of Pan-Africanist perspective on this. So we must find our own solutions without the assistance of Western powers. We can ask for help, but it's not for them to tell us what to do. African problems cannot be truly resolved without unification of our continent. Because if our continent was unified, this whole Zimbabwe situation wouldn't have happened. Not in the way it would. Because you couldn't do it. You couldn't put sanctions on one little part. You can't just put sanctions on New York without putting sanctions on the whole of America. So if Zimbabwe was part of a wider Pan-African country, you couldn't just put sanctions on Zimbabwe. The rest of Africa could protect them and could help them. And if we had more inter-Africa trade, the sanctions wouldn't work anyway. That's why you have sanction busting in various countries around the world. You try and put sanctions on China, it's virtually impossible to put sanctions on China because China trades with everybody. So if the West said we're not buying Chinese goods anymore, it would hurt a bit. But China sells to everybody around the world, so it's not going to be destroy them. And because China does a lot of internal trade, So it doesn't cripple the economy because they can trade with each other and they can trade with Asia, etc. So next one. So we need to stop all interference into African affairs. We don't want any Western interference. And the West should stop funding opposition parties, nakedly supporting opposition parties. Can you imagine if Zimbabwe or Ghana openly funded the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats or the Conservative Party because they didn't like the government in Britain? It's outrageous. But Western governments do it all the time, constantly funding and giving resources to opposition parties, which is illegal, by the way. And they're doing it all the time. It wouldn't be accepted in Europe. Next one. Next one. Right, let's just go for a few bits. Right, let's see the social situation in Zimbabwe. First decade, Zimbabwe did very well. One of the most educated countries in Africa, one of the most educated workforces, was very good on its opposition to apartheid, even introduced things like a minimum wage. So really positive things, really positive things were introduced. Let's keep going. But things start to deteriorate and get worse. So economic inequality within the population decreased. So that was really positive as well. And you see there was lots of positives early on. During the 1980s, GDP per capita did increase by 11.5%. Sounds like a lot until you see America increase by 38% at the same time. The emergence of a generally entrepreneurial African business class, yes, it did. So that was another positive. But the IMF program in the 1990s eroded Mugabe's popularity. That was the major problem, and that was what caused the economic collapse and the whole problems with repression, corruption, and the economic collapse. This was an absolute negative tinderbox situation that you could see coming here. And they did seize the land, of course, which is rightfully they should have taken the land. How they did it is a question mark about how they should have done it. But at the end of the day, how were they going to take the land without, it being unpopular? It was never going to be a popular move to take the land without compensation, because that's the big contradiction. Why should they be compensated for land that was stolen? So you saw this situation, and look at the impact of taking the land and the collapse of the white farmers. Now, the question is the chicken or the egg. It's very easy to say that because Zimbabwe took the land, that's why production fell. No, it's not. The reason why production fell is because it was sabotaged and it was undermined. Because if you say, well, how comes the Africans, when the land went to Africans, we couldn't produce it the way white people did it? Like, we're thick, we're stupid, we're unintelligent. Well, who was doing the land before? It's like saying slaves didn't know what they were doing. But who was tilling the land? Who was picking the cotton? We were picking the cotton before. So if we took over the land, we could pick the cotton again. So to say that somehow we didn't know what we were doing is nonsense. Now, was there mistakes? Yes, probably. But it's our right to make mistakes if we want to make mistakes. Wasn't there mistakes over Brexit? Wasn't there mistakes over the COVID vaccine? But what's it got to do with Ghana? What's it got to do with other countries around the world? What mistakes Britain made? So what has it got to do with Britain and the West? If Mugabe or the ZANU-PF implemented some issues and some problems happened with the way that the land was redistributed, it's nothing to do with Britain and the West. Okay, so let's keep going. The currency collapsed as well, so you had loads of problems with the currency. Now look at this contradiction. We talked about South African leadership. Look at this last one. The new ANC government, which only came to power because of people like Zimbabwe helped them, including arms, including military support. Zimbabwe gave all that to South Africa and the ANC, and look how they betrayed them. South Africa, when they came into power, ANC, when they came into power, cancelled the trade agreement with Zimbabwe, which caused further problems and tariff problems. So contributing significantly to the deindustrialization of Zimbabwe. So here's your neighbor, you're supposed to be your friend, undermining you with the economic situation. So it wasn't as supportive as we thought. So that was something, I thought that was pretty sad that I actually found that out. Next slide. We're coming towards the end now. So more social advances. So some more problems with the economy. So pros and cons and lots of economic problems. So just put these up so we can have a look at some examples here. These are just some examples of some of the problems that happened. 50% of the population received less than 15% of the total annual income. Isn't that ridiculous? That was in 91. The richest 3% of the population received 30% of the total income of the country. Isn't that madness? How is that fair? How is that fair? Can't be fair. So look at Zimbabwe's economy has shrunk since 2000. So in 20 years, the Zimbabwe economy hasn't grown. Can you imagine if you were earning the same you was earning in 1999 or 2000 as you were now? How well you would be off now. And some people haven't increased their income, and I understand that. I've been made redundant. People have suffered in this country too. But can you imagine if the economy in Britain didn't grow at all for 20 years, what would happen to people? Keep going. Right, let's have a look at this situation. This is coming to one of the last slides now. So life after Mugabe, this is just the last 3 years. Again, it's quite difficult to actually find detailed information of this period. So I found a few things like fuel price rises, 130% price rise. This is like putting petrol up. If you imagine petrol going up in Britain from £7-8 to £16 to £20, because 130% would put petrol from £7-8 to like £20 overnight. Could you imagine what would happen? There'll be riots in Britain, absolute riots. There's no way people would go from £7-8 for a gallon of petrol to £20 without any consultation or any conversation. Just put it up like that. And remember, the average person in Zimbabwe is earning very little. So 130% increase in oil prices in fuel is phenomenally problematic. And remember, we're talking about a country that might still use oil for heating and food and things like that. We're not talking about a country that's like everybody's got gas and everything like that. And remember, Zimbabwe, even it's in Africa, but Zimbabwe is not a hot country particularly. Yes, it gets warm, but it's like South Africa, it has winter. So people still need heating and they need oil fires and stuff like that. So when oil goes up, it hits them harder. It's not like Britain where if you're not driving your car, you don't really need oil. People don't buy oil, you know, because they don't have oil to generally speaking, to heat their homes or to use, you know, fires, etc. Okay. So you've got to understand that context. So food supplies run short. The shops were getting empty. All the problems you saw on the TV, there's loads of video coverage of all this situation. And basically saying Mugabe had to go. And that was the pressure around the world. And then what happened, of course, in 2017 is basically there was an internal coup d'etat. And we saw that Mugabe's wife was positioning herself to become the next president. And I think it broke the camel's back. That was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. It was just one too many issues. Mugabe was very old by now, was, you know, in his 90s. And it was just getting ridiculous that he wouldn't step down. There was no transition problem. You remember we said in the leadership, what is your succession program? So somebody in power for 40 years into their 90s and still not giving up power, no succession plan, just shows people hanging on to power for the sake of hanging on to power. Mugabe was also worried that if he came out of power, he'd be prosecuted, that he would go to The Hague for war crimes and things like that. So one of the ways to get rid of leaders is, without killing them, of course, but to get rid of leaders is to give them immunity. People don't like this. So generally, people don't like it. If you've had a bad leader or a leader that's corrupt, people are not happy to negotiate that they're going to be immune and they're not going to be prosecuted. But if you don't give them immunity, they won't give up power. So you've got this catch-22 problem. If you tell somebody, if you give up power, I'm going to arrest you. As soon as you give up power, I'm going to arrest you and put you in prison and I'm going to charge you with crime. That person will never give up power because most presidents are immune from prosecution whilst they're the president. So what you do is you virtually guarantee that they'll never give power up. So sometimes you have to accept that you're not going to prosecute the president so you can get them to step down. So if you threaten people, if they step down, why would they step down? So you've got to understand the context of these things. It might not seem fair, but it's perfectly logical. If you were told you were going to be put in prison if you stepped down, would you step down? You wouldn't. So that's more or less the end of the presentation. That gives you, I hope, gives you that flavor and that context for Zimbabwe.